Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Sturzenegger, dear Federico, welcome to Vienna. We are deeply honored that you made the long journey from Buenos Aires to Vienna to be with us here tonight. When Argentina comes up in conversation in Austria, the country divides. Some reach for their heart or blood pressure medications. Others, as me, can barely contain their excitement because they see that radical reform is possible after all. But what unites all of us is the sense that Argentina is very far away from Austria, not just geographically, but also politically. And of course, there is something to it. We don't have a peso that loses value week by week, even if inflation seems to be more stubborn than we would like to be. We know nothing of rates of 250% and more by year. Our GDP per capita is about 4 times higher than Argentina's. Even adjusted to purchasing power, it is still 2.3 times as high. Our last sovereign default does not lie a couple of years behind us, but more than a century. So far, so comforting. Less comforting is a look at the core fiscal data. Austria, with public spending of 55% of GDP, is more state-heavy than Argentina was at its darkest. Our budget deficit currently stands at 4.2%. The 2 years before Milei took over in Argentina, it was about 4%. And we in Austria, we are still happy that it's not higher than the 4.2%. The budget deficit in Argentina has been eliminated not by raising taxes and fees, like in Austria, but by cutting public spending. Our public debt to GDP ratio matches Argentina's. On the share of state ownership of listed companies, over 1/5 in both countries. When it comes to the entanglement of state and economy to bureaucracy and overregulation, Argentina needs no lessons from us. It's rather the opposite. While our inflation rates still remain lower than Argentina's, Austria seems to be caught in the same cycle of inflation and stagnation that has plagued Argentina for decades. So Buenos Aires, I would say, is closer to Vienna than many would like to admit. Which brings us to the key question. If the starting conditions are not so different, what can we learn from what's happening in Argentina right now? Our guest today got very clear answers to that question. Federico Sturzenegger holds a PhD in economics from MIT, supervised by Rudi Dornbusch and Paul Krugman, which is a rather interesting combination of economists, I would say. For sure, Paul Krugman could hardly have imagined that one of his PhD students would end up orchestrating the most radical deregulation drives of our time. From 2015 to 2018, Federico was president of the central bank, and since July of last year, he serves as Minister of Deregulation and State Transformation, and he is the architect of Milei's deregulation agenda. Federico Sturzenegger has not come to us to tell how bad things were. He has come to us to tell us what can be done about it. How to get a country back on track after decades of mismanagement. How to read laws not as a lawyer, but as an economist. Asking the simple but decisive question, do we actually need this? Or does this rule mainly protect those who drafted it in the first place? And he will tell us what happens when you act on the answers to all those questions consistently. The results after 2.5 years are, with all that remains open, impressive. And that deserves an honest discussion, not ideological, not reflexive, but with an open mind. Federico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Franz. Well, I should start by pointing out that for us, Qatar is a very important country. You know why, no? We won the last World Cup in Qatar, the most important date in Argentinian history of the last 4 years. And so I am told that Argentina is very important for you, because in '78, I think you beat Germany 3-2, okay? So, so anyway. So we're not going to talk about soccer today because we're playing each other in a few weeks in the US. I think we shouldn't have a problem, both of these teams, in passing. But remember that in Qatar, we lost with Saudi Arabia in the first match. So, so soccer has this surprises. So all the best to the Austrian team in the World Cup. The second reflection I want to do, well, I'm from Argentina, so never ask any economic advice from an Argentine, okay? Because as you know, we've been the worst student in the class for the last 50 years. We never turned in the homework. We got in every fight that we could in any class break. So we're not a role model for anything. But that behavior really took us through a path of stagnation and poverty. I always mention when I was born in '66, Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. In fact, I was 10 years old and still Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. And today the income level of Argentina is 1/3 that of Spain. So certainly the not doing the homework and this idea of fighting with everybody at every opportunity didn't do well with us. And in the 10 years prior to Milei becoming president, 2 million Argentines left the country. And the people that left the country were our sons and daughters. It was our grandchildren, it was our nieces. And at some point we realized that if we didn't do a very significant change, we were going to see our grandchildren grow over a Zoom, maybe in Madrid, or maybe in Barcelona, or maybe in Milan. And this is the reason why people decided to vote for very radical change in December of '23, and that's how Milei, he claims to be the first libertarian economist to be president of any country in the world, became president. And so the idea of the talk today is to tell you the journey we've kind of gone through over these last 2 years in an economic program which has, I would say, 2 big pillars which feed into a third one. So the first one has to do with, I'm going to go into detail in just a second, but the first one has to do with fiscal soundness. You were mentioning, France, that you have a deficit here, but you cannot imagine what the deficit looks like in Argentina for 100 years. And President Milei say, well, listen, my fiscal rule is very simple. I'm always going to have a fiscal surplus. So he cut government expenditure by 30% in his first month, and he achieved 5% of GDP. He achieved a fiscal surplus, and we've kept the fiscal surplus since then. The second theme is economic freedom, which I think is what brings me more to Agenda Austria. The idea that people free are able to do amazing things, and that the hurdles that people face, much more than the market, much more than technology, much more than the product, are the hurdles that the government puts in their way. So Javier says, I want Argentina to become the freest country in the world. And by the way, I think something right we may be doing, because if you look at the Economic Freedom Index of the Heritage Foundation, Argentina was the country that escalated most positions, both in 2024, which we scaled 25 position in that ranking, and 2025, where again we escalated 25 positions in the ranking. So my presentation is mostly going to be about this agenda. If you want to bring freedom to your people who are in favor, who are against, but most importantly, how do you do it? How do you go about doing it? And we think those two pillars, I said, feed into a third one, which is the respect of property rights, because you can have property rights to be sound and safe in a country if the government is on the verge of fiscal disaster. Because if the government is on the verge of fiscal disaster, sooner or later it's going to do something nasty to your property. It may increase taxes, it may confiscate, it may default, it may expropriate. So there's no security for property rights if the fiscal is under a very weak situation. And also, I would say every regulation is an attack on property. I'll just give you an example, which is very simple. If you're an owner of a piece of real estate, and then someone comes, one day comes a regulator and says, oh, I'm going to put rent controls, or I'm going to put this or that, I'm going to restrict what you can do with the property, certainly that property will have a lower value. It restricted what you can do with it, and therefore regulation very clearly affects the value of your property. And we don't think that you can have sound and prosperous growth in an economy if you don't have a full respect for property rights. And this is really the item in the production function that Argentina could never deliver on. And this is basically the main focus of the Milei administration. So before I go on, let me just show you a few data of what has been happening in the country. Oh, I hope I don't fall here. So let me just show you some data. Here, the upper left, okay, so the pointer I think is not working here. So the upper left graph is inflation. So you see we inherited an economy where inflation was not only rampant, but was escalating. When Milei became president, inflation was running, this is not a joke, at 1.5% per day. Okay, and so it was really escalating. You see, we kind of went close to 300%. Now we've brought this down to 30%, so very successful. The second graph is output. So I'm not showing the last 15 years, but Argentina has been stagnant. I mean, has had no economic growth in 15 years. And then you can see that the economy has resumed the growth trajectory. It grew 6.6% in the first year of the Milei administration and 3.5% in the second year of the Milei administration. If the projections of macroeconomists kind of bear out, he will finish his first term with the economy growing 20%, I repeat, after 15 years of stagnation. And something which is quite interesting is that if you see the graph on the right, it's exports, which also had been stagnant for a long time, really they're taking off. And exports are growing at a rate which is 8 times the rate of growth of GDP. So we're kind of in the middle of an export-led growth, which is much more sustainable because, I mean, the world for us is infinite, and this is a new one for Argentina. Well, here in the lower panel, you have the deficit. So you see we were coming from this very large deficit and kind of cold turkey. They were changed from one day to the next, and we kept it that way. And the interesting thing is that, and I'm going to talk more about this in just a second, when you reduce government expenditure, because Milei say, I'm going to have a fiscal balance, but you have two ways of achieving a fiscal balance. You can have a fiscal balance through reducing government expenditure, or you can have a fiscal balance by increasing taxes. And Milei say 100%, not 99%, well, actually 150% of the adjustment is going to be on government expenditure. And why do I say 150%? Because the guy wants to lower taxes as well. So you have to do more than what you need to balance the budget, okay? So this adjustment has been done by reducing government expenditure. Now the magic, and I think I'm going to explain that this is the most popular thing that you can do in your life. Look, the most popular thing a politician can do is to reduce government expenditure. Why? Because every expenditure has to be financed. So when you reduce government expenditure, you reduce the taxes that you have to charge people to pay for those expenditures. And reducing taxes is very popular. So for example, when we reduce government expenditure 5% of GDP in 1 month, that meant that we didn't need anymore to have money printing, which was financing half of the deficit. And the money printing was generating inflation. So when we stop printing money, that's how inflation came down. And inflation is a tax on the poor. So when you remove this tax on the poor, the poverty rate plummet. And you see here the poverty rate had reached kind of 52, 53%, has come down to 29%. It's the biggest decline in poverty in the statistical record that we have of poverty rates in Argentina. And this was done because of the chainsaw. By the way, I don't know if you see here, I have a pin, which is a chainsaw, okay, which I wear proudly, my chainsaw. You're supposed to laugh, okay? And so reducing government expenditure through the chainsaw basically allows us to reduce the taxes. An important tax that we reduced was money printing, was the inflation tax, and that basically implied a huge improvement in the actual incomes of the poorest in the society, and that's why poverty fell. So there isn't anything more popular than reducing government expenditure, because Milei says, look, Milei says the politicians are amazing. Look at what the politician convinced us. They convinced us that getting into our pockets and taking the money from us so that they spend our money was good for us. So that the politicians spend our money, they convince us that that's much better than me reducing what the politicians spend so I can give back people and I don't have to take the money out of the people. So he says, Milei, oh, these guys are geniuses, okay? That they've brainwashed our mind and convinced us that giving the money to the politician was good for us. No, man, give me back my money. That I know how to spend it much better than the politicians, okay? So again, reducing government expenditure is a political miracle. And this perhaps here in the lower right corner is perhaps what we're a little bit more frustrated about, which is that real wages, even though the economy has been growing very strongly, exports have been growing and the economy has been growing, real wages have really kind of, they have recovered, but they haven't really kind of moved up in the same way that the GDP. And we definitely hope this will, at some point, this will kind of also catch up, but I didn't want to not show it to you, okay? Okay, so some principles about fiscal. Here I'm just going to say, this is the only thing I'm going to say about the fiscal adjustment, because my conversation is going to be mostly on deregulation. But I said, so Milei reduces government expenditure 5% of GDP, and everybody said recession. But I told you that there wasn't a recession. The economy grew 6.6%. So how come? Well, because when you reduce government expenditure and you reduce the taxes that you charge people, then the people are going to spend more if you charge them less. So that 5% reduction was 5% reduction in the taxes that we charge people. I mentioned 2.5% was a reduction in inflation tax. I already mentioned that. So why should the fiscal adjustment generate a recession? And in fact, two very famous Italian economists, Alberto Alesina and Francesco Giavazzi, Alberto from Harvard University and Francesco from Bocconi University, they had studied fiscal adjustments in Europe. And they already had shown that the fiscal adjustments, which are achieved through a reduction of government expenditure, tend to be expansionary. So the theory says it, and the empirics also already said that. So we were not at all afraid about doing this fiscal adjustment. And the other thing that is interesting is I already explained how reducing the government expenditure helps reduce the taxes. So the other thing which I think is interesting is that the adjustment in government expenditure is a political asset, not a political liability. And in fact, in the midterm elections, 2 years into the term, we won the elections by a landslide. Of course, if you took these taxes away from the poor particularly. So I think those are kind of interesting. I may say that, for example, we have a very large social program, which is an allowance that we give to poor children, and the president didn't touch that allowance. In fact, he strengthened that allowance, but the reduction in government expenditure was very much on the pork and barrel, the corruption, the inefficiencies. I'll show you in the next slide so you get an idea. The second big theme I talk about economic freedom, which is the deregulation agenda. And I want to say the following, that first of all, the deregulation agenda is an anti-corruption agenda. because each regulation is an opportunity for some. I probably here in Austria you don't have this problem, but this is a serious problem in Argentina. But well, I don't know. I take the Fifth Amendment. Okay, so in Argentina, I mean, anything that means that you have to move a paper from one desk to the other is an opportunity for someone asking for some help for the Sunday barbecue. Okay, and so eliminating the regulation is anti-corruption. Okay, but the other thing, it's basically very much in favor of small firms. Why? Because all the regulations, 100% of the regulations are anti-competitive because they generate a cost, and they generate a cost of entry. So they restrict, but 100%, there's no one which is not that. And so for a big firm which has its compliance department, it has the lawyers, maybe it's not such a big thing. But for the entrepreneur, the guy who's starting, which are the guys who are going to challenge the market, are the guys who are going to steer things, are going to shake the economic environment, with the regulation, you kill those guys or you make it very difficult for them, because for them, that's a hurdle that's very difficult to pass. So regulation is very much anti-small firms, it's very much anti-entrepreneurship, it's very much anti-growth. It's a shit, okay? Excuse my French. You know, I like when Elon Musk, if you read the biography of Elon Musk, and he's working with the engineers in Tesla, and he says, the best peace is no peace. So that has to be the spirit, okay? And the other thing that he says, that he only congratulates the engineers which simplify a process so much that they have to come to him and say, look, I made a mistake, you know? I simplified too much, I realized this, I cannot simplify, I have to put it back. So you need to simplify as much and test yourself really how much was necessary to reinstate. If you never are in the phase that you have to reinstate something that you eliminated, you don't have the slightest idea, maybe you're halfway of what you should have done. Okay, so this is a few numbers on this thing, which is the chart on the left is the number of public employees that we've spared off. So out of 300,000, we have 65,000 less. So it's more than 20% of the labor force. Nothing that the government does has been affected by this. So that's the biggest proof that all this was waste. The reduction of this is more like $2.5 billion in savings, which means that it's $2.5 billion of less taxes that I have to charge people to pay for this. And what do people do when they have $2.5 billion in their pockets? They go out and spend it in useful things, not in useless things. Because here, by taking the money to giving it to the politicians, we're spending the money on useless things. Okay, we give it back to people and they spend it on things that they want to spend it on, and that's useful. Okay, so this is kind of the jobs. And then what I have here on the right is my deregulation effort. I've eliminated 15,000 regulations. How do I measure a regulation here? It's when you go to a law, and the law has an article which obliges the private sector to do something. Oh, you have to register here, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. Well, when I eliminate that article, I count that as a deregulation. We've done 15,000 of those. So I think it's really kind of one of the most ambitious, aggressive, and successful deregulations. By the way, right now, as we speak, the Chamber of Representatives is voting a law that I sent to Congress. I didn't know it was going to vote exactly when I was speaking here, okay, when we arranged this with France 6 months ago, and which eliminates out of 100 laws. So I kind of got rid of 100 laws. So I will let you know when we finish in the dinner if I got the votes or not. Yeah, we have the votes. I'm pretty sure we have the votes. Okay. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about regulation. And the first thing I want to let you know is that, or I want to share with you, and I don't know again if we can bring this completely to Austria or not. So this is for Argentina. That regulation is not the result of a benevolent central planner thinking how to do good. It's not that. Regulation is most of the times the result of some interest which uses the state as a vehicle to generate a regulation that benefits them. And I'm going to give you an example in the next slide, which I think is pretty clear on this. And I say that these interests, which kind of build this regulation, they operate as velociraptors. Everybody saw the Jurassic Park movie, correct? Raise your hands. Everybody has seen the Jurassic Park, okay? Great movie. So I remember that the guy which was taking care of the velociraptor said, these guys are very smart, and they test the fence. They constantly test the fence until they find the weakness in the fence. I don't know if you remember that line in the movie. So the interests are like velociraptors because they kind of keep pounding. No? So they come to my office to see if they can get a regulation. I kick them away. So they go to the other minister to see if they convince them if they can get it. If they go to the executive, another minister. If they don't convince the executive, they go to Congress to see if they can get a law. If they can do it with this government, they try again with the next government. And eventually, they kind of break the fence and they get the regulation which provides some privileges for them. And then you're doomed, because once you have that privilege, you create rents. And then they use these rents to perpetuate the protection. So once the velociraptor has broken the fence, there's no way to put in the genie back into the bottle, okay? Because the rents kind of are used to sustain this, okay? So not a central planner. Regulation is motivated by interest. And I'm going to show you this example, which I think is absolutely mind-boggling. It's amazing. You know, Argentina is a large country. There are only 47 million Argentines. If you place Argentina over Europe, it stretches from Portugal to Estonia. So you get an idea of the size, okay? 47 million people, so very thinly populated. Yet in Argentina, it was forbidden, the government had forbidden the use of satellite internet, say Starlink, to name a household name or the most successful company. And you say, why on earth? Who on earth can be so evil to get this country with thinly populated, with very remote areas in the mountains, in the Pampas, in Patagonia, and forbid satellite internet? So who was it? Well, it was the largest media group in Argentina, who are the biggest providers of internet. So for them, it was much easier to convince the regulator, and probably the guy who did the regulator is someone who earns $1,000 a month of income. So it's much easier to convince a guy which earns $1,000 per month to issue a regulation saying that no one in Argentina can buy Starlink than competing with Elon Musk. You never want to compete with Elon Musk. Okay? So we had this regulation. So if you look at 2003, there was no users of Starlink in Argentina. And Javier Milei, in his 10th days in government, he breaks that piece of paper and kind of lets the market free. And there you see the users in 24. There you see the users in 2025. And I think that if we do the 2026, which I still don't have the data, basically it's only going to be all black, because you have many people in Argentina that the only way they can get is through satellite internet. How much money did the government spend? Zero. How much money did the previous government spend laying out fiber optics? $7 billion. So we were spending $7 billion of taxpayer money to do something which was useless, because you had an alternative technology which didn't require any government investment, okay? And today, 3 million Argentines get internet through this mechanism, and I tell you, it's 3 million votes. Because for someone who's in a remote area who had to do 50, 60 kilometers to get to a place where you had internet connection, and you realize that the only reason was that because the government didn't forbid, and you had to bring this guy called Javier Milei to say, I don't care about who's behind or whose interest is behind, I'm going to let people choose freely what internet they want, and they did. And they chose it. So let me show you this video.
Ok, Tony. Nos vemos. Suerte. Ahí va saliendo. Conectado a la mula con internet. Y los caballos. Y todas las mulitas para el trabajo. Mira. Impresionante.
But you see that the second mule here has the Starlink antenna, okay? So it was absolutely inconceivable. So this is also entails a very significant lesson, which is that regulation is extremely popular. Deregulation is extremely popular. That's why Milei says your minister should not be called the minister of deregulation, it should be called the minister of happiness. Because each time you deregulate, you allow people to... You think we can solve it? Because I really need that video, the audio for the last slide. Okay. Anyway, I want to finish with an audio, and I didn't have the audio. Okay, so the other thing I want to mention is that you want to think of deregulation as having two layers. There's the economist layer, and there's the political layer. Because what did I say? I say that the velociraptor, once the velociraptor breaks the fence and builds its privilege, it gets rents and uses these rents to perpetuate the system and the protection and the privilege. So say, for example, I do competition policies. And what's the economist layer? The economist layer is that you want to do competition policy because a more competitive economy works better. We know that from Econ 101. But there's another dimension, which is the political dimension. That when you do competition policies, you dilute the rent of the guy who was benefiting from the privilege, and you're removing the privilege and forcing them to compete. And when you dilute the rent, you dilute their ability to perpetuate these bad policies. So the regulation has these two layers, the economist layer and the political layer. Let me give you an example. In February, we passed a labor reform in Argentina. First government since the return of democracy in '83, which was able to pass a labor reform. And the labor reform also has two dimensions. It has the dimension of how the labor market works, which would be the economist dimension, but then it has a dimension which has to do with wage negotiations. So for example, in Argentina, wage negotiations are done through a centralized union, which sets the wage for the whole country in a particular sector. So the change that we've done in the law is that now we've allowed for a firm level union. And if the firm level union, if the workers in a firm, they want to unite, they want a different contract, and they agree with the manager, that contract is going to prevail over the national contract. So that, I think, provides a lot of flexibility to the labor market also, because I mean, to have a one size fit all in a country which is so large doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But certainly it kind of weakens the power of the unions, and the unions are one of the most important blocking agents of the Argentine economy. And we've built a system which legally workers are forced to transfer money to the unions, which they don't want to transfer. They don't want to do that. So how do I weaken the system? I weaken it by changing the way wage negotiations are implemented. When you do a negotiation at the firm level, then you can get rid completely of this union fees, because the union is not participating any longer. Okay, so you have these two layers, and where the underlying diagnosis that we have with President Milei of the Argentine economy is that the Argentine economy created a legal architecture, and this legal architecture was a cobweb of interest and privileges that were built. So in order to eliminate and change the system and free the system from those chains, you have to blast away the legal architecture. You have to change the legal architecture, you have to change the laws. Okay, so we basically, you change the law, you generate competition, you dilute the rent, you unleash freedom and growth. So I came to this conclusion many years ago, and so I decided that the president in Argentina, which was going to take office in 2023, would have a compendium of all the laws that he or she would have to change. So I started a project 2 years before December 2023, after we started in May of 2022, and our project was that we were going to review all the laws of Argentina, and we're going to classify the laws in laws that had to go like the 100 that I have in Congress right now being voted, laws that were okay and the laws that had to be changed. But we wrote what change had to be implemented. Okay, it's not that we said, oh, you need to change the hydrocarbons law. No, we wrote the change. Okay, so we worked for 2 years, and by December of 2023, we had everything mapped out. So we had the laws that had to go, and we had a proposed change in the legislation of the laws that we thought had to be changed. Okay. Now, why I think this is very important? This is very important because of something that I called the principle of Marx. I made this up, okay? It's the principle of Marx. So I put this up, and you may think I'm referring to Karl Marx, but not, actually not. It's not Karl Marx I'm talking about. So you may think I'm referring to Groucho Marx. I think even the age group of this audience, I'm safe to say that you know who Groucho Marx is, okay? No, it's not Groucho Marx. So I'm actually talking about Daniel Marx. And you say, who is Daniel Marx? And I say, Daniel Marx is a friend of mine whose last name happens to be Marx, okay? So what's the story of, what is the Marx principle? So in 2001, I was Secretary of Economic Policy in the national government, and Daniel was the Secretary of Finance. So one day we have a very big discussion with the finance minister, which was a legendary figure. Some of you may have heard the name, a guy called Domingo Cavallo. Okay? So he was the finance minister, so we have a big fight, which lasted maybe 4 hours, sweating, and we were discussing A or B, A or B, A or B, 4 hours discussion. We finally conclude we have to do A. Fine. Next morning, the minister signs the bill, or the whatever it is that he had to sign, and it was B. I said, so I go running to Daniel, and I say, Daniel, what happened? I mean, didn't we decide A? Didn't we say, yeah. So someone tricked us. No, he says, no, what happened is that Horacio Liendo, which was the legal secretary of Cavallo, had come to Cavallo with a decree, and the decree said B. So Cavallo, he has the paper in front, he has to act, A, B, fine, B. So what is the lesson? And I think this is the most important thing I've learned in politics, which is that the person that wins the debate is the person that puts the paper on the table. I mean, having great ideas and do this, do that, useless, completely useless. What you have to put on the table is the paper that the politician needs to sign to proceed. And if you are the one, and because no one is going to do that job, everybody has great ideas, but then you have to sit down and work the thing. It takes a lot of work. So you know nobody's going to do it. So whoever puts the paper on the table is going to win the debate. So you've won 85% of the intellectual debate, no, not 85, 95% of the intellectual debate by putting the table, because you force everybody else to discuss on the basis of your proposal. So they may touch things on the margin, but you've already won the debate. So this is my principle of Marx, and I said I'm going to do the principle of Marx to a galactic level, okay? Which is I'm going to do the principle of Marx on the whole legal system of Argentina. So what I'm going to tell you is how did I did that in 2 years with 7 people, 4 law students of the university where I was teaching, which is Universidad de San Andrés, a constitutional law professor, and my TA from my principle in economics course. And we had the hefty budget of 0. Okay, so we had no money, we were 7 people, and we had the aim, in 1.5 years, we had to have a whole review of the legal system done, okay? So what you have to sit and start reading. And the first thing that you may think that this is a very difficult job. And I tell you, no, it's not a difficult job. I mean, it takes time because it's a lot of laws, but it's not difficult. Why? Because the laws are so grotesque, are so clearly the result of an interest that has pushed, that when you read it, you say, this is ridiculous. So it's very simple to figure out what you have to do. It's not difficult, okay? Let me give you an example. The first law that I started doing, the fisheries law. Not a very relevant law in Austria, okay? You don't have, I think, fishing boats or vessels. But I'll tell you the story anyway. So, you know, when you have, for example, in Argentina, you have the continental sea, there are fish. So the fish, they're not property rights on the sea. So what you have to do is you have to auction off the right to fish. And actually here you actually need government intervention because you can have a depletion of the resource. So the government has to set the maximum capture feasible to preserve the procreation of the fish so the fish renews it. Because if you fish everybody, it's gone. So what you should do, the theory is very clear. You should do an auction, and then whoever is willing to pay more for the right to fish a certain amount of fish, they get the auction and get the right, and then the government and the Argentines appropriate the rent, which is truly theirs, because the fish is a common resource of the whole population, because again, there are no property rights there. So the fisheries law was a law which was made in the late 60s by the military dictatorship, and the military dictatorship couldn't care less about the appropriation of the rent. What they wanted were boats. So they wrote a law which said, if you do a boat, I give you the fish for free, virtually. So they were using the resources of the fish as a kind of implicit subsidy for the naval industry. Okay? You may agree or you may not agree with that. It was just a subsidy. I wouldn't do it, but okay, it has some rationale. But the problem starts with the velociraptors, because after 10 years, you've created a shipbuilding and fishing establishment. So these guys went to Congress and they managed to change the law into a law which says that the only guys who can get fish permits are the guys that fish. So they locked in the system completely, okay? So basically you have 15, 20 companies which are fishing our fish for free, laughing at us, and we Argentines are a laughing stock because that happens, okay? By the way, we tried to change this law in the basis law at the beginning of the Milei administration, and you know how many votes I got in Congress to change this law, which was basically the proposal was that when the current concessions expire, because Milei doesn't want to affect any property right, but when they expire, there was going to be an auction among Argentine vessels. And you know how many votes we got? 0. So these guys kind of operated with the governors, a huge corruption web behind the scenes. There was no possibility of getting the law passed, so it's a pen. But I mean, when you read that, it takes you just 1 minute to figure out what you have to do. So it's not difficult, okay? So you have to have some principle. Let me just say another example. In our constitution, which is a great constitution, it's a very liberal constitution, says, for example, that you have freedom of commerce. You can do activities, you can. So why do you need a law to regulate an industry if the industry is free? Everything is free, okay? But at some point in our minds kind of got confused, and the military have a lot to do with this, so they started doing these laws that say, yeah, the Constitution allows you to do this, but let's do the following. We are going to prohibit this activity. Unless you register. So you want to do candies. The Constitution says I can do candies. No, you can only do candies if you register as a candy producer, okay? Now, if you register as a candy producer, fine, you can do all the candies that you want, okay? So you create a registry of candy producers, you create a government agency to manage the registrar of the candy producers, and a number of sanctions for those candy producers which have not signed in the registrar. And you find this over and over and over again, and you say, why the heck do we need a register of candy producers? So, very easy. So you need to have some basic principles to kind of give guidance to this work. So for us, it was a very liberal principles. So we wanted to foster competition, eliminate barriers to entries. We wanted to avoid economic transfer. We want prices to kind of signal where resources should be allocated and not kind of hidden things, and things that are not very transparent. That's why I say increased transparency in government spending. Everything that we could do to reduce government expenditure, we also was the benchmark there. And as Milei says, we never tackled this as, let's try to simplify this law. We always ask ourselves first, should this law exist in the first place or not? So we really went deep in that. It was also easier to get rid of it completely. So I mean, we had an incentive to ask that question. Another idea that I want to mention, because we're very much inspired with Austria, which is this idea of introducing competitions to the regulator. So what's this idea? This idea is that some areas where you have a regulator. For example, you have in the US, you have the Security and Exchange Commission. You know? It's a government office which basically supervises, for example, the issue of bonds, the issues of equities, the Security and Exchange Commission. To be honest, I don't know why you need that. If people want to issue bonds, they can issue bonds. I mean, it's if you buy a bond, you better know what you're doing with the... Anyway. So Austria has its own Security Exchange Commission, but Austria has allowed the Vienna Stock Exchange to set its own rules for issuing bonds and equities. So somehow you have a dual system. You have the official system where you go to the regulator full-fledged, or you go to this kind of unregulated or semi-regulated sector where you go to a private party and the private party sets the rules for the issues. And no wonder when you look at the issues in the Vienna Stock Exchange market, you see that all the small firms' issues are done through this unregulated segment, which is much less bureaucratic, it's much more efficient, it's much smoother. So the idea that we have, and we wrote an op-ed in The Economist with Javier Milei at the beginning of the year, is that wherever possible, we should generate where we have a regulated market, we should generate a companion unregulated market. So if the regulator is actually solving something, well, people will stay in the regulated market. But if the regulator is just only asking for paperwork, which serves no purpose, people will migrate to the unregulated market. So we put some competitive pressure on the regulation of the regulator. And we have an example, for example, in the first executive decree that Milei implemented, for example, when we did the satellite internet, when Milei came in on his 10th day, he did a huge deregulation decree. Our constitution allows the government in exceptional circumstances to issue a decree which has the force of law. It can be challenged in the courts, it can be challenged by Congress. So part of the piles that we had prepared began this executive decree. And so, for example, that's where the satellite internet restrictions were lifted. And so we had one market that nobody had the slightest idea of what it was. So I said, I'm gonna try in this market this unregulated thing, which was warrants. Warrants, just I explained very briefly, is a financial instrument which you issue backed by your inventories. So for example, you're a wine producer and you have the barrels of wine. You say that barracks, you have the barrels of wine. It's an inventory there, no? You have it for 10 years, so you want to make it liquid while you have the inventory. So issue a warrant, which is a financial paper which is backed by the barrels. So it provides liquidity to your inventory. So a very significant financial instrument. Nobody knew what it was, okay, anyway. So I created the unregulated market in warrants in that executive decree at the beginning of the Milei term. And for 1.5 years, nothing happened. And then suddenly, amazing. I mean, the market started developing the unregulated warrant markets. Producers start issuing their own e-warrants, which people were taking because they trusted them. Then the financial sector created private companies which were checking the inventories. So say Banco Galicia or Banco Santander, they created this very efficient private company which was checking the inventories, and the market blossomed. And the funny thing is the fees in the regulated market fell to a third. Of course, because these guys were charging these fat fees because they were kind of alone, and when they felt a competitive pressure, they tried to save part of the market. Okay, so I think this is a very interesting. I think, is a very interesting idea to where you have a regulated market create the unregulated segment. Of course, everybody says, "Oh no, you have to protect the." Well, it depends on you if you believe in the free power of will and that people are adult and they can take choices and make choices in their life. We make very fundamental choices in our life where the government doesn't meddle and mess up. Does the government tell us how many kids we should have? Well, in some countries, yes. Okay, but not. Okay, so maybe it's not a great example. Okay. Anyway, so let me just connect the economic theory with the practice of deregulation. So what I have in this slide is a number of things in the economic theory which supposedly are justifications for regulation. And I'll try to argue that they're not good justifications for regulation. So let's challenge the theory of regulation as much as we can. So let me start, for example, with asymmetric information. Asymmetric information was a concept which was put in economic theory by an economist called George Akerlof. He wrote a beautiful paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He won the Nobel Prize for this idea. So what this idea is, and I think of a market where there's the buyer and the seller have different information. For example, the used car markets. So I'm selling a used car. The guy who's buying the car doesn't know as much about the car as I do who I'm selling. So you say, why is this guy selling the car? Well, maybe the car has a problem, correct? So it lowers how much I'm willing to pay for the car. Now, because my valuation falls, then the guy who has a good car says, well, maybe I don't sell it because they're not paying anything for the car. So the good cars get out of the market. But then if the good cars get out of the market, then the guy who's buying, then they know for sure that the cars are bad cars. So they lower further how much they're willing to pay for the car. And you see that it's a process that it may unravel and the market may disappear. Was it understood? More or less? Yeah? ¿Se entendió? Yes? Okay. So whenever I talk with a regulator, they say, oh, asymmetric information, so we have to regulate. I say, well, is the used car market in the US regulated? No. But wasn't it the thing that was used to justify the concept? Well, I mean, the market has ways of solving the asymmetric information. You have dealerships, you have guarantees, you can go to a mechanic. So in what sense do you think that government intervention is going to be better than the ways the market has to solve this problem? So we have to be very careful. It's not that because we have a market failure, we have a blank check that justifies regulation. You have to show that regulation is going to be better than the market solution to that. So once I gave a talk and someone said, market fails, use markets. Externalities. Externalities is a typical case that for justification for intervention, because the typical example is bees and, say, fruit producers. So if you have a bee production, they go and pollinize the trees. So the honey producer has a positive externality on the producer of fruit, correct? And the fruit producer has a positive externality on the bees because it provides the flower from which the bees can get the pollen. So if the guy who's having the fruit there's no price for the bees, then there's going to be kind of underproduction of bees because there's not going to be sufficient incentive to generate bees, which create this economic value. So it's called an externality. Well, can the market solve the externality? Well, Ronald Coase, a very famous economist, also won the Nobel Prize. He said, let people negotiate, and then people will negotiate and solve the externality problem. The example I have here is an Argentine company called Biflo. And what these guys did, they kind of enslaved the bees. Sorry, if there's someone from the Green Party, please forgive me, okay, or the animal. So they give something to eat to the bee, so the bee only goes to the oranges and not to the peaches. And so there's a market for bees. You rent the bees, and now you can rent the bees for your orchard without them going to anywhere else. So the market has generated a technical solution to the externality. So again, the other example that I want to mention is public goods, because public goods, it's in its name, correct? Public goods is a good provided by the state. And when you read the textbook about public goods, it basically says that there are certain goods that have to be provided by the state because the government, the market will not provide them. And those are goods which say are non-excludable and non-rival. Non-excludable means that if someone buys the good, other people can consume it without paying for it. I'll give an example in just a second. And non-rival is that if someone consumes the good, other people can still consume it. So the typical example in the textbook is the lighthouse. So you put a lighthouse, you issue the beam, it's non-excludable because any boat can see the beam, and definitely it's non-rival because if one boat sees the beam, that doesn't mean that the other boat cannot see the beam. Okay, but also the boats go into the sea, go through the sea, so I cannot. So who's going to pay for that? So nobody's going to pay for that because there's no way to charge people for that service, and I use it anyway. So you have this issue of the free rider, and the free rider means that it has to be public. You've heard, those who here who have studied economics, probably you've seen that and you've heard that. Well, there's a very famous paper by Ronald Coase, the economist I just mentioned a while ago, about the lighthouses in the US in the 19th century, and he found, oh surprise, that they were all private. So you say, look, it's impossible. How can they be privately provided? The lighthouses, we said it's non-excludable and non-rival. Well, who were providing the lighthouses? The nearby ports. The nearby ports needed the lighthouses so that people could sail safely into the port. So if I define the good as lighthouse, it can be privately provided, but it's not the right definition of the good. The good is port services, and port services includes a lighthouse. So we have to be careful when someone say, oh, this should be publicly provided. It's not so clear to me. So we want to be careful about that. Well, competitive regulation I've already mentioned. Let me tell you this story, which is totally amazing. So in Argentina, we have a beverage, which is called yerba mate. It's like an energizing weed that we drink, like a Red Bull South American version, okay? So this is an industry which is in the northeast of Argentina. It's very competitive, thousands of producers, tens of thousands of producers, hundreds of brands, distributors, etc. So what does the government do when you have a competitive industry? It transforms it into a monopoly. So the government created el Instituto Nacional de la Yerba Mate, the National Institute of Yerba Mate, where it sat everybody to do what? To increase the price. So, I mean, I go to the university, I read, I have these courses on antitrust and how, firms interact to avoid competition, all that. And in front of my eyes, the government is taking a competitive industry and transforming it into a monopoly. You tell me, can we have something more grotesque than that? So what Milei did in this executive decree that I'm mentioning for the third time now, he didn't eliminate the institute, but he eliminated the power of the institute to intervene in the prices. And what happened is that the price fell to half. So we learned that this institute, the only thing it was doing was doubling the price of this product. And you can imagine that this was not taken lightly by some of the producers. But all is well that ends well, because once the domestic price fell, the industry started looking outwards. And today, well, by the way, a footnote, there was also a prohibition to increase production. So we also got rid of that, okay? And So the industry started looking outwards, and now we have record production and we have record exports. Okay, so I'm submitting to Congress a law. It's an anti-competition law. How many? I'm 45, or am I already an hour? I've already 45. Okay, I have 15 minutes more. So I'm submitting to Congress a law which is an antitrust law, but the focus for me is the government, because the government is the biggest enemy of competition, much more than firms. Everything the government does is anti-competitive. So I want the Antitrust Commission to have the power to go against legislation which is anti-competitive. And that takes me to my last point here, which is, if you have a firm which becomes very large, should you do anything about it? And actually, if the firm is large and has decreasing average cost, you actually want them to produce a lot and to be a big player in the market, because you'll have lower cost. But the important thing that you have to keep in mind is that the market be contestable, that someone can grab this market from this producer. So for example, you remember Nokia was the biggest producer of cell phones at some point, and then BlackBerry came, and then BlackBerry was displaced by the iPhone. It would have been a terrible mistake to split BlackBerry at some point because they have a large market share. What you have to be very vigilant about is that the market can be taken away from them. Okay, so I'm starting to wrap up. Did we solve the video, the sound thing? Okay, perfect. So, okay, so here I am with my 7 guys, and we have 1.5 years to review all the laws of Argentina. So I said, we sat down, we started reading, we started correcting, we started editing the text. I need help. Eventually, I need help. So actually, on and off, a team of 100 collaborators participated. Maybe some helped me with a few laws, one with one law, etc. So I have to decide, how do I ask for them to collaborate? And who do I ask for help? I have 2 questions to answer, okay? So let's imagine a niche. I don't work on environmental laws. It's not a topic that I'm too interested in. So I need someone to help me with environmental law. We have 40 environmental laws. So I ask, who can help me with environmental law, which thinks a little bit in this kind of libertarian fashion? Say, Jose Perez. Call Jose Perez, he's your man, okay? So I call Jose Perez. Jose, can you help me with environmental laws? And the guy says, oh yeah, we wrote a paper and about what has to be done with environmental laws. I say, okay, if you want, send it to me, but I'm telling you, I'm not reading it. I'm not going to read it. Send it to me, it's going to be in my mailbox. I'm not going to read it. I tell you, I'm not reading it. So he says, okay, why? No, I'm not interested. I mean, diagnosis, stories. I mean, we already know what the troubles are. We need solutions, not diagnostics. The Marx principle. The Marx principle is the paper that has to be signed, not the paper which tells me what the problem is. So he says, you want, we can do a meeting. I said, I don't do meetings. Okay, you want an executive summary? I'm not going to read it. So he says, what the hell do you want? I said, well, pick a law. So for example, the glaciers law, which is a law which basically forbids mining, and download it into a Word file, write the changes, and send me with track changes the changes. That's the only thing that I'm going to take. So this turned out to be a wonderful methodology, because when I reached that point and asked people for this, 70% of the people disappeared. Because people are great to sit over coffee and solve the world. But then it's a totally different thing to say how we're going to write the item C of Article 3 of the Glaciers Law. Maybe some people were good and they were not willing to do that kind of work for free. Fair enough. Others maybe didn't have a clue. So for example, someone come to me and say, oh, I want to help you. Okay, fine, what do you do? Cattle. Okay, take law 24076 and send it with track change. I never heard back of the guy. So it allowed me to find out who was willing to help me get the job done without myself spending time filtering. So that was kind of a big, look, this was kind of on the dot. I mean, so it really helped me, because when someone brought me something that I liked, then I said, oh, why don't you look at this other law? And my piles started growing. The piles of the Marx principle, the piles of the things that the president had to sign. The second thing is, who can help me? So my first temptation was to go to the big law firms. Whoa, totally useless. Look, worse than useless. It was worse because these guys, they cash and their fees are for sale in a very complicated system. So I would sell them something, they would give me something twice as difficult. But no, useless. I tried twice, I forgot. These guys are totally useless. They're never going to tell me how to simplify a system. And in fact, so the second alternative is the expert. Useless. Because the expert has already so much of his human capital vested in a system that probably he will try to improve it on the margins, that he'll never tell you, get rid of this. This is total bullshit. That's my job, okay? Anyway, so who helped me? The victims. So say the commercial lawyer, who was fed up, who knew all the paperwork he had to file, and he knew it was totally useless because nobody looked at it. The victims of the system were the guys that did the job with a challenging mind, with a revolutionary mind, and this was the profile of people that helped me, okay? So, and the end product was this. So by the time the President Milei was about to be sworn in, I walked into his office and I put these two piles of paper on the table. I've known President Milei for a while, since the time I was governor of the central bank, so we were good friends. I said, Javier, this is what has to be done. And we had a 6-hour meeting where we went over everything that was in this project. And then this was a fundamental input of two pieces of legislation, the executive decree that I've already mentioned several times, and the basis law that we sent to Congress 10 days later, which were a little bit of a political shock because it's like you have this outsider that comes, and a lot of people said, well, this guy have the team, will have the energy, will have the preparation to get a reform agenda on the table. And then on the first 20 days of the government, we issue the executive decree and we take the basis law, and it was a big shock to the political system. And they had to bend because we were just coming from an election where the president had been elected with 55% of the vote. So we got a tremendous amount of reforms done. And I call it the surprise factor, because you have to act fast before those interests even have time to react. So this was so marvelous, okay? Here you have, so I'm finishing now, Franz, but just show you some effects of the micro deregulation. No? So for example, here I have the price of the yerba mate, which I mentioned, that you see how it fell 50%. Here is the price of clothing, the price of appliance, the price of iron, the price of medicine. This over here is a fantastic example because we had a rent control law. And the rent control law had basically withdrawn the rentals from the market because it was too tight, etc. So in the executive decree, we basically eliminated any law, listen, no law associated to rentals. You have the civil code and the commercial code, which regulates commercial contracts, and we say a rental contract is a commercial contract. You don't need a special law for the rentals. So that means that you could write the rental for the time you wanted, in the way that you wanted, paid in the way you wanted, in the terms you wanted. And it's interesting because the people who proposed the law, they always said, oh, the tenant is weaker than the land owner. And I say, I don't know, in economics, I have supply and demand. And I never had the concept, supply is stronger than demand. There's a supply and there's a demand, and there's an equilibrium. What is this thing that the supply is stronger or the demand is stronger? Bullshit. And so we eliminated everything. What happened to rental prices in this free world? They came down 30%. And they came down, and what you see here is the supply of rentals, which is the orange line, so you see it skyrocketed immediately. And the price of rentals fell in a month's time. So it was a tremendous success for President Milei, because it says freedom works, okay? I go on TV and I tell people, tell me, I tell the journalist, please, let's tell the people to tell me how the government is making their lives miserable. So please write to me and tell me how the government is hurting you. So please put my email, okay? So, eventually, we had to put a website in the ministry so that people can send their suggestions for the regulation. We got 15,000 of those, and we work on them, and it's a tremendously useful material. The victims, again. One day, a guy writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with my watermelons? So I was intrigued. So I write back and say, what's the problem with your watermelons? How can I be of help? They don't taste any good. There's nothing I can do about that. Oh, he writes back, my watermelons are great. In fact, I'm an exporter of watermelons. So I said, so what's your problem? That's through email, correct? And the guy was kind of throwing me the data. No, the problem is that for the last 10 years, I've been trying to convince the agricultural department to let me package the watermelons the way my client abroad wants the watermelons packaged, because apparently there's a regulation which says that the watermelons have to be packaged in a particular way that the military thought about in 1983. And he says below, P.S., Federico, we're not talking about enriched plutonium here. It's just watermelon, so who on earth cares how you package the watermelon? So he says, I've been 10 years going through the offices of the government trying to tell them, let me package the watermelon. So I don't have, so I said, what do you do? You're not exporting? No, I am exporting, yeah. So what do you do? Well, what I do is I package the watermelons the way the government wants them to be packaged. I put them on the boat, and when the boat leaves the port, 100 meters, I ask the boat to stop. I send 70 guys. The guys unpack and repack, okay? So I'm reading this, no? And kind of my eyes are swelling. I have tears in my ears, in my eyes. And I look at my team and I said, this story has to be true because it's impossible to imagine this, okay? So it has to be true. And it was fascinating because I started looking into this, and then I realized that he was touching the tip of the iceberg. You know, the iceberg has 10% above the surface and 90% beneath. So I asked for all the regulation on fruit production to be printed, and it was 2.5 kilos of paper. So it's a pile this big. So you need a PhD in literature before becoming a fruit producer, so you can read all those volumes. And so I sat down with the Food and Drug Administration and said, what should the government do with fruit production? And he said 2 things. I had the big pile in the back. Only 2 things, yes. I need to know who produces where. So if I have a plague, I can coordinate with the producers to contain the plague. And I also have to do the phytosanitary certificates when you export, because you don't want in Rotterdam to open a container of apples and it's full of fleas because they're going to close the market. That's it. That's it. So I threw to the garbage all the other regulation, and I wrote a regulation which was 2 pages, which was these 2 things, okay? And a few months later, this guy sent me this video. So I want to share the video with you.
Hoy es un día histórico para la localidad de Juan José Castelli Chaco. Esta sandía es la primera sandía en la historia que se logra exportar al país vecino de Uruguay. Y queríamos darles las gracias exclusivas a nuestro presidente de la Nación, Javier Milei, a nuestro ministro de Desregulacion, Federico Sturzenegger, porque sin ello esto no hubiese sido posible. Específicamente, Federico logró disolver muchas trabas burocráticas que teníamos en aduana, y hoy un sueño que se transformó en realidad, hoy es un hecho concreto. Esperemos exportar muchos equipos más. Así que, Federico, querido, infinitamente gracias, y este videito es para vos.
It's fantastic. And actually, a journalist from the New York Times came to visit me, and he was spending some time in Argentina. I told him the story of the watermelon, so he said, I'm going to go and visit this guy, okay? I want to start Milei's campaign in 2027 here, in this town in Chaco with this guy, okay? And he went and interviewed, and you will see the pictures of this guy in the New York Times magazine a few weeks ago. And he rings me up from Chaco and says, this guy is going to be the next president of Argentina. So that's the guy's very, but again, maybe this is a great video to finish the presentation because it shows that deregulation is the most popular thing that you can do. Basically, we've eliminated the restrictions, and they have a guy in Chaco in the middle of Argentina, in the middle of the field, thanking you just for getting the government out of the way. So I don't know if there's a lesson from that, but certainly in the case of Argentina, as I said at the beginning, the economy has grown 10%, exports are growing 8 times as fast as output, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we freed the Argentines to be able to do all the great things that they can do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It goes on. Apparently, it goes on.
It goes on. Yeah, you have the possibility to ask some questions. We start with the discussion here on the podium. You mentioned the victims that helped you the most, but how did you fend off all the interest groups that benefited from the regulations before? Because there must be a lot of resistance.
Yeah, again, very important, the resistance is not from the people. The people are your supporters, so the faster you move the regulation, the more political capital you build. So the resistance are of the interest. So the fight with the resistance is in the backstage. And the people are your biggest allies. Now, in my case, the way I've managed to do these 15,000 regulations is because I work for someone who's, fuera de serie, what would be, he's from another world, which is Javier Milei. And also because the world is very different from what it was 15 or 20 years ago, we have social media, which allows for a direct contact between government and the people. So we've de-intermediated the press. We can circumvent the press completely. We can have a conversation with the people direct. So what happens with Milei is that, for example, I announce a deregulation, and of course, the newspapers immediately smell the blood, correct? Because they know that the deregulation, there's going to be someone affected. I repeat, the people who are going to benefit are the population at large. The one who's going to be affected are the interests which had generated the regulation to protect and generate the rent. And as soon as it gets in the newspaper, President Milei is retweeting that news supporting the deregulation. And that for me is a formidable, that's all I need. Because these guys say, who am I going to lobby in the government when President Milei himself is endorsing the deregulation? So it somehow kind of dilutes the resistance of this interest. I tell Javier, it's like you're walking ahead of me with your machete and you're clearing the path ahead of me. And the reason I can move fast is because you're doing the heavyweight, because I'm just kind of operational. You're making it operational. But he's kind of taking the brunt of the political support for the deregulation. So you need someone like that, which is totally convinced, 100% convinced about the need of freedom in Argentina. And in fact, he has this dream of showing to the rest of the world that freedom works. But he's my biggest ally, and without him, I would not have been able to do anything. So So I think that's a very special aspect of Argentina. And then you have some business people, they accommodate, they say, oh, wait, we had this rents for 40 years. Okay, we turn the page, we do something else. And then you have others that fight. And I love the fights.
So it's the backing of the president,
Yes.
and it's the creating your own media
Communication channel.
communication channels. Yeah. Whenever we talk about Argentina and Austria, then the political reaction is, this is so different because here it's so much more complicated. There are 3 parties in government, and here, and to get a majority.
But in Argentina, it's very complicated also. Eh?
Yeah, I just wanted to say because you didn't even have a majority in parliament.
Yeah.
And you erased a lot of jobs in bureaucracy. You cut public spending by 30% in the first year. So how was that possible?
No, but I mean, that's very popular. Because people were fed up of paying with their taxes, all these guys which were doing nothing. I mean, for example, we had a Ministry of Social Development, and then there was a parallel minister with 3,000 guys. Where are these guys? Nobody could find the guys, and they were all getting a paycheck. So people are saying, finally, someone that comes and says, we're not going to continue financing with our taxes this thing. So no, I mean,
But
I'm
you didn't have the votes in the parliament.
I'm not saying that you can make the argument here in Austria. I'm just telling you what it is in Argentina, okay? Argentina, the government had grown itself too much with useless thing, with a lot of politics and political appointments, and people were fed up, and they were waiting, praying for someone to come to cut all that thing away. And so no, that was not. So actually, it's the most popular thing that you can do.
But the opposition had to vote for it.
No, well, that's the surprise factor, because we did the executive decree, we did a huge deregulation of the economy. And then we did the basis law, which was a little bit chopped down and cannibalized in Congress. We discussed it 7 months before it got approved. But for example, there I had a change in the employment law, the public employment law. And and kind of at the beginning, the political, it's true what France was saying. For example, we had only 8 senators out of 72, and we had only 38 representatives out of 270 in the chamber, so it's short of a miracle, but the fact that we could do it and we could put it on the table in the first month, in the first 20 days, was very difficult for the political system to just basically block completely, because 55% of the people had voted for this gentleman. So they had to go along. They didn't go along completely, but they got along sufficiently. Then, this law, when we passed this law had an item which is called delegated. We managed to convince them for 1 year, which is called delegated powers, which is on a certain area that the Congress gave us, which had to do with straight reform, we could change laws. So it's like Congress for a certain period gives the executive the ability. Of course, then they can challenge. They can say no if you do something, but you can do that. So I had another year where I could work cleaning and trimming out the laws using the delegated powers. And we did 72 delegated decrees, which was the biggest use of delegated decrees in the history of Argentina's democracy. Then after that, that's it. So I had to go down to decrees, which are instruments which were of the power of the executive itself, didn't need Congress. Then we won the midterm election, so now we have much more. So now we have close to 100 members in the lower house, so 100 of 272, so we're much closer to getting things approved. And we in the Senate, I don't remember exactly the number, but we created with the allies a block of 44 out of 72, so we're in very good shape in the Senate. So now we are going back to Congress to get the law. So for example, I was mentioning right now they're voting this thing, probably it's been voted already, a law which eliminates 100 laws. And in the Senate today, I had a step to get a law which the Kirchneristas had passed a law which doesn't allow foreign direct investment in the agricultural sector in Argentina, because it forbids foreigners of buying land, and we're basically repealing that law. so that foreigners can invest in the agricultural sector, in forestry, in irrigation. The way Argentina was built as a country which took in immigration, and in our constitution say that immigrants will be able to, they have the same rights as foreigners, and that they will be able to buy land. In fact, you know, my great-grandfather from Switzerland, because the Sturzeneggers are from Switzerland, no, but I'm only 25% Swiss. No, I'm 50% Italian, 25% Spanish, so I'm 100% Argentinian. But the guy, my great-grandfather from Switzerland, the government promised him land. Then they went and they defaulted, okay? So he never saw the land, okay? So we were kind of we were messing up already since the 19th century. But okay, so we're rekindling that spirit, okay? And so now we're back to Congress. And in fact, I think that this first semester will be the semester with the biggest reforms since the early 90s in Argentina, given our ability. So we've done the labor reform, within the glacial reform, we have this land reform, we're going to have a reform of navigation, we're going to change the corporate law. So there's a very exciting agenda right now on the way.
And how do you design economic policy in a way that prevents the future government of taking them back?
Well, the question of sustainability is the big question, but remember for example, some people say build institutions to lock in the changes. And I say totally useless, because the institutions are the result of an economic structure. So if you don't weaken the rents of the guys, the institutions are going to be blown to pieces. So what you need is to weaken the rents of the blocking agents. So for example, my labor reform weakens the power of the unions. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen from one day to the next, but it's weakened. And for example, in the last 6 months, we've moved in terms of trade agreements and trade openness more than what we have moved in the previous 50 years, particularly with a free trade agreement with the European Union, that is with you. And for us, that's critical, because it locks in the strategy to dilute not because of its institutional, because it dilutes the rents of these blocking agents and of the crony capitalists, because it forces a certain amount of competition on them. And it's that weakening of their economic power which is going to ensure that there's no coming back. So for me, the labor, because I think the unions are the biggest source of the biggest medieval forces.
We have two of them.
Okay, so the labor law for me is a very important answer to this question of sustainability. Look, I'll illustrate it to you with an example, which I think I used it today at lunch. It's like in the Middle Ages, you have the French Revolution, correct? And the French Revolution, you had Louis XVI, you had the clergy, and you had the landowners. So these were the privileged. And then you had the people which were poor as shit, okay? So what did Robespierre do? Well, they did some beheading, but let's kind of assume now.
So we don't have to.
Okay,
we have to do that.
Let's not go that way, okay? But so the clergy told Robespierre, relax. In Mass on Sunday, we're going to speak well of the French Revolution, okay? And Robespierre said, no, give me your land. And when they took the land from the clergy, it diminished the economic power of the clergy, and therefore made it weaker in the role to kind of go back to the ancien regime. So for me, if part of, why is Argentina the closest economy in the world? It out of coincidence. It's because there are people who were trying to build protection. So if we do free trade agreements, we weaken the power of these guys. Okay, the guys are gone. And that's what's going to ensure the sustainability. So I say the free trade agreements and the labor reform is the biggest progress in undermining this system of privileges that we've done since the system was created in the late 60s. So, the job is not nearly closely done, but it's interesting. I think we're on
And so before you have the possibility to ask questions, one point I took from your speech was also that it's not just enough to get rid of regulations. You have to get rid of people in bureaucracy, because otherwise they invent new.
Oh, yeah. No, if people don't have anything to do, they'll find a way of bothering the private sector. And they'll believe that they're doing good, eh? It's not that these are evil people, but also if you don't have a job and you want to remain sane, you have to find something to do, correct? So, yeah.
So, yes, there are.
Maybe we can have a microphone?
Yes, there's a microphone coming. And
I suggest, Franz, I suggest that we take 3 or 4 questions.
Good. And please, questions as brief as possible, because I think there are many
Let's
questions
take 4.
No. Der Engelberg ist der Erste gewesen, der aufgezeigt hat. Dort.
Very quickly, I couldn't follow how the unions reacted to your initiatives. How did you deal with possible strikes, whatever?
Herr Lippert in der zweiten Reihe.
Let's take 4.
Thank you very much for your speech. Excellent speech. We hope that you are coming to Austria and going to be our Minister of the Regulations. But my other
Well, listen, when I leave the government, for the business people here, I'm happy. If you want to hire me, no problem.
We need you anyway. You mentioned 2 million Argentines left the country. Did some come back, or do you hope to get them back? We have 2 countries, 2 of your neighboring countries are the main attraction to Europeans. That's Uruguay and Paraguay, you know that. And that's for tax reasons mainly.
Yeah.
The question is whether you are interested to introduce a flat tax in Argentina, and or how much is your income tax, the rate percentage-wise, and your corporation tax at the moment, and do you envisage perhaps to change the situation to the better?
Great.
So, Herr Dorda ist der Nächste, dann der Herr Brammer, dann die Frau Meyer-Beuerl. Aber okay.
Christian Dorda, Agenda Austria. We are having in Austria something we call social partnership, Sozialpartnerschaft, which consists in mandatory adherence to, on the one side, a labor union, if you want to say that, and the other side to an entrepreneurial chamber.
That's the 2 medieval institutions.
Very strong. My question, do we have something similar with mandatory adherence in Argentina? How did you overcome that?
So, and we take a 4th one, das ist der Herr Brammer. Ja, du bist der Nächste dann, also Meyer-Beuerl und dann du. Er kommt so in der nächsten Runde erst dran.
It might sound strange to you because of the size of our country, but we don't have 1 Austria, we have 9 Austrias. We have a 10th Austria coordinating the 9 and arguing with the 9. So we would have to change the structure of the country in order to have a real deregulation. Did you have to change the structure of your country? Or do you have any recommendation to us? Because it would really be a great help, I think. Yeah.
Okay, let me start with this last one. In Argentina, we're a federal country. So we have the provinces, we have the national level, and we've done all this restructuring in the national level, but you have a lot of, the provinces have a lot of state workers, and there are lots of inefficiencies and blah, blah, blah. So, and high taxes and regulation. For example, I deregulate something, and some provinces, they recreate the regulation. So when we tell the president what to do about that, the president says nothing. Nothing at all. Oh, but you know, it's very high taxes and it affects competitiveness and nothing at all. What is not understood about nothing at all? So his point is, people voted for us to make the national government work. So we're going to focus on the national government. We're not going to distract ourselves, and we're not going to distract ourselves with governments on which we have no power, and we're going to achieve very little. In 2027, we're going to go to the provinces, and our candidates are going to go there wielding a chainsaw. I told you I have a chainsaw pin here or there. Okay, so they're going to be wielding a chainsaw. Say, we're here to cut provincial government spending, and therefore to cut your taxes. They will have the credibility because we've done it at the national government. They will have the credibility. 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 They and they will choose if they want that or not. And that's the way to do it. So for us, it's no, we've never asked ourselves about changing that would be a constitutional change. And it was never in our mind to change the constitution because we have a good constitution. And you know how lawmaking is, you know what comes in, but you don't know what comes out. So if we have a good constitution, just leave it, sit there. I mean, it's okay. So that would be our approach to that.
There was a mandatory membership.
The mandatory and the unions. No, I mean, what was the debate with the unions? And certainly it was not easy. If you say, did I get everything I wanted in the labor reform? No. For example, we have these mandatory contributions which both unionized workers and non-unionized workers have to do to the. So we had a big fight in the sense that we take them off or not, and there was kind of a channel of communication with the unions, and finally we said, okay, we're going to keep those mandatory fees, but then they allowed us to change the rest of everything else and it was pretty smooth, correct? So. You say, did I get everything? And I kind of play the role of kind of the most radical guy. So that's very helpful for the government because say, look, you have to agree to change all these things because if not, Federico is going to come and it's going to wipe out everything. And for me, the most important thing, because at the end of the day, it kills the mandatory fees is the changing the wage negotiations because if a firm does an agreement with its workers, it doesn't have to pay any mandatory fee to any union because now the union is the workers of that firm and they will make the arrangement between themselves, okay? So at the end, eventually there will be a fee to the workers of the firm, but not to firms outside. So I'm very happy with the way the law came out. I would have wanted more. For example, I would have wanted, and I publicly stated this, to eliminate the mandatory requirements. We kind of went that far, but we got, I think, the structural change that I needed, okay? So there was kind of a compromise, but, it's the essential thing, which was the wage negotiation. There was no compromise possible on that one, and we got it through, and I think it's important.
So you were the radical guy, and Javier Milei, the radical one, and Javier Milei was the pragmatic one. Did I understand that you said you were the radical one, the radical?
Yeah, the radical, yeah.
And Milei was the pragmatic one.
Well, Javier Milei is always more radical than everybody else. So now the 2 million people, that left. I was telling a story to a journalist earlier this evening, there's this movie called The Nucleus. No, okay. No? Anybody has seen it?
No.
I'll tell you the argument, maybe you remember. The nucleus of the Earth stops spinning. So they have to kind of go to the nucleus and kind of with some atomic bombs, they were going to make the nucleus. Someone now, do you remember the movie? Okay. That's a Hollywood movie. So they kind of build a ship that's going to go to the center of the Earth. It's obviously full of scientists, correct? They're going there. And so they're coming into the Earth, and then one of the scientists says, well, what a burden we have on our shoulders. Because if we fail, 7 billion people are going to die. And then the French, the French are always kind of beyond good and evil, correct? And so the French guy, which was kind of more senior, says, 7 billion people. I couldn't care less about the 7 billion people. I'm not here to save 7 billion people. So the other scientist says, so what are you here for? I'm here to save 2. My wife and my daughter. And I think that those who are involved in the Milei government, we were fearing of losing our children. So I have a kid which is 21, I have a kid which is 20, and I have a daughter which is 16. And if Argentina would have continued the way we were continuing with the previous government, I would have asked my kids to leave. And you were asking me what's happening with that, and now the kids are coming back. I think that's the most amazing thing that we're doing. Sorry, I apologize for getting emotional, but I feel it so close to the reason I'm in this government. And the only thing I want is to grow up with my kids close to our family. And this is what the Argentines were losing. I mean, and I have the brother of my wife lives in Madrid. I have a brother that lives in Washington. And we're seeing our nieces on the Zoom, and we want them to be close to us. And for that, Argentina has to be a vibrant place, a meritocratic place, a place with opportunities, with growth. And once I was, basically, I think it was at the end of 24, I was coming back with Javier from a conference. And you know, you're always kind of doing Twitter and looking at things. And then a survey popped up, and it said whether the young people wanted to leave the country. And then with the Kirchnerista, 75% of the children were leaving the country. I mean, the university, a private university where I teach in Buenos Aires, we were teaching the guys and they were all leaving. And this survey said that 75% of the kids wanted to stay in Argentina. And Milei says, oh, we've done all these things. We've brought down poverty. We've brought down inflation. The economy is growing. But this is the most important thing that we're doing. No? And he doesn't have kids. So, but for those of us who have kids, and I have kids in the age in which probably I would have lost them, I think this is a fundamental thing. And I think it's the fundamental reason why people support Milei, because he thinks he's opening a path for our kids to stay. Now, you talked about taxes and all that, no? So one thing that I use the opportunity to kind of advertise this, we're starting what's called the Golden Visa program, because in a world that is becoming, I mean, you know, you have a lot of, one thing which is great about Argentina, if you say what defines Argentina is friendship. Friendship. I mean, the thing which is special about the Argentines is that you get together with your friends. Then, you know, you go to the US and it's so cold and people are so independent and so detached. And I would say even those that come to Europe or even cultures which are similar to us, like Spain, totally different thing. And so I think that's the most amazing thing of Argentina, the fact that this bond that you establish with your community and your friends. And the other thing which is amazing of Argentina is it's a place where some conflicts in the rest of the world just are simply not there. For example, religious tensions, it's non-existent. And I think that's, or racial issues. We're not a very racially diverse society, but we are very diverse in religious terms. And it's certainly not a conflict. So we're establishing a golden visa program to come to Argentina, because, you know, Argentina is the only place in the world which is out of reach of intercontinental ballistic missiles. We're exactly opposite Mar del Plata, which is a resort south of Buenos Aires, is exactly opposite Beijing. So if you want a safe place in the world, a friendly place, a tolerant place, you may want to think without great weather, great wine, and great beef. If you're a vegetarian, don't come, okay? And so the golden visa. Now our income tax is 35% in the upper level, so I don't think there's a great thing. But let me tell you something which I wanted to share with you, which I think is pretty cool. We're changing the corporate law. And in the corporate law, we're going to have a chapter for companies that don't have humans. Companies that are robots, run by artificial intelligence and robots. And the problem that we're having with the deployment of artificial intelligence is limited liability. So you're going to have robots, you're going to deploy these robots to do things, and these robots are going to have this software which is very complex and to do things that you can't anticipate. So the question is, who's going to be responsible for imagine the robot goes out and kills someone, okay? Or strangles something or hits someone, so who's going to be, so if you don't have, I mean, the Dutch invented capitalism when they invented the limited liability corporation. So if we don't have a framework of limited liability for firms of artificial intelligence, it's going to be very difficult to deploy that technology. And for example, a few months ago, there was a ruling in California where an artificial intelligence did something undesired. And then the chain of responsibility went almost to the guy who had invented the computer, correct? So people say, I cannot do AI in California. It's too risky. So in our corporate law, we're going to have a chapter which is for automated companies, and those are going to have a different corporate rate. And our inspiration is Ireland, because Ireland, for example, has a corporate tax for firms which basically have intellectual property, which is different from the regular corporate tax. So for example, I don't know if you know this, the company which owns the software of the iPhones is an Irish incorporated company. Obviously, the owner is Apple, but it's incorporated in Ireland. The day this company was incorporated in Ireland, the GDP of Ireland increased 25%. And each time an iPhone is sold in the world, there's a royalty which is paid to this Irish company, which pays a small corporate tax in Ireland. So I want Argentina to be a country with 47 million people and maybe 500 million AI agents and robots, which are working all around the world, but are incorporated in Argentina and paying the corporate income tax, maybe a low corporate income tax in Argentina. So I let France know when we get this law passed, in case you're interested of establishing a business there, okay? And so we'll all be waiting for you with our open arms.
So there's one question left. It was the first question, resistance of the unions. You
I subsumed it in my answer to the unions, yes.
So, Conny Meyerbold.
A second round?
Yes.
Okay.
Muchísimo gusto, señor Ministro. I lived in Buenos Aires from 2001 to 2008. I'm an alumna of Universidad de San Andrés.
Okay.
Thank you for your great presentation. So I think I do know firsthand in which disastrous situation Argentina has been. It's great to see that things are changing. However, there's also always a however, and I'm quoting The Economist here, which is a paper not unsympathetic to your government. The country and your government is not out of the woods yet. Lots of pymes, small and medium enterprises had to close down. And while there has always been a huge informal sector, unemployment has risen. Can you maybe touch upon these points, how you think go about these? And another point, since I care a lot about Argentina, I hope you're also on a good path what concerns corruption, because there are investigations also against high functionaries. And I think the rule of law and investment security is also important in an economic sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're referring also to the Economist article with Manuel Adorni, Mr. Millet's chief of staff. This was the thing we talked. Rainer Borian, all the hands are raising now. They have to wait a bit because we still have a waiting line. Rainer Borian.
First of all, let me congratulate to your amazing success, which you had so far. It's fantastic. I think it's one of the biggest economical success stories at the moment for the last 10 or 20 years. Now,
Poland is, I think, the biggest success story. But anyway,
okay,
go ahead.
Yeah, but turnaround success stories. I would say that Austria is in a very bad shape. My feeling is, and I think that many people will agree in this room, that we are approaching an iceberg, but we suffer from a lack of fundamental structural changes. Now, unlike Argentina, the Austrian constitution does not permit the replacement of legislation with decrees, with emergency decrees. Everything has to go through parliament, In fact, we don't only have the parliament, we have the social system, which was mentioned before, and we have 9 federal states. Now, the result very often, or in most cases, is the least possible denomination in negotiations. Everything is negotiated with a coalition of 3 parties. What advice could you give to Austria, which doesn't have those degrees and doesn't have this system which you had?
Franz Hörhager, quite the neighbor.
I think the status of despair in Austria has not yet reached the despair that you have reached 2 years ago, but there's a growing amount of people that is approaching that, and I think this shows you the turnout here. I have a critical question to you as a former central banker. There was a lot of media coverage when you had the midterm elections. I think that was what they were called last year, where Congress was elected, and the polls were not very good, and then the US administration stepped in and offered you a $20 billion swap line, which I think took a lot of weight from the peso, because the peso was in bad shape, and now you are back, I think, to 1400 or something, which is a sustainable level. And my question would be, what are you planning with the peso? What is the central bank policy? And is a small devaluation and constant devaluation part of your economic plan?
So, and we have, again, Franz Hörhager, but the younger one. There you can see everything is in order in Austria, first the father, then the son. In the back, please.
Thank you. There's an even younger one, so I also have kids, and hope that they can stay here. So thanks for the inspirational speech. One of the main blockers that we see here for reform is a kind of a difficulty to differentiate between necessary and unnecessary government functions. What is your target size of the state, and how would you think about that?
So,
I go?
yeah,
I mean, the target size of the state. Look, I'm still trying to find something useful in the state, but I'll find it. I'll find it. Okay, eventually I'll find it. So not, I tell you a little bit jokingly, but we don't have like a number. We don't think it would be appropriate to have a number, because everything you have to analyze it on its merit, but we really think that, and I think when I did the presentation about the reasons that people invoke for having regulation and how weak the theoretical foundations for that regulation is, which means state intervention, I think we have a long road ahead in kind of reducing the size of the state. So we'll kind of continue in that dimension. The peso is an interesting question. I tend not to talk about the macro issues because now I'm the micro guy, okay? So I don't make statements. That's reserved for the finance minister and the president of the central bank. I think it's very important that you have a unique voice on these issues in the government. But what I can say is that Argentina is in the middle of an export boom. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, last year we exported $80 billion. Chile exports $60 billion of mining products, and we exported $3 billion when Milei came to government. Now we're exporting $6 billion, but we still have to increase that 10 times because, you know, we share the mountains with Chile, so we have the same amount of minerals as they have. And, you know, we have the second largest reserves of natural gas in the world, larger than those of Texas, so you get an idea of the size. I don't know if you were aware of this. And the war in the Gulf has immensely increased the economic value of having a reliable source of gas from an area which is geopolitically safe. So I have no doubt that the natural gas in Argentina will be more valuable, and Argentina will be the most reliable and the source of natural gas for Europe in the next 30 years. So what we're seeing in the energy sector in Argentina is just mind-boggling. I mean, in 3 years, we're going to be exporting $40 billion of oil, which is 1 million barrels per day. But the thing is not oil, it's gas. We've just solved the problem of property rights with our seeds. So in certain areas of Argentina, we're going to double agricultural production. We're going to have 4 cellulose factories coming into Corrientes now that we repeal this law, which doesn't allow foreigners to buy land and woods, etc. So Argentina is kind of in the middle of an export boom. So the real exchange rate or the peso has to strengthen real value. I mean, I think that's inevitable. I think that the best response to that should be to open the economy much faster. So, because if you don't open the economy and you have this boom in exports, your real exchange rate is going to appreciate a lot. So you have to compensate Argentina quickly. Argentina basically trades a third of what it should trade, given its size. And so we need to double our export sector and our import sector. So I think kind of the exchange rate policy will be more the trade policy than the monetary policy. Now, it's true that our going to the decrees and the use of decrees, it's true that our constitutional setup allows for that. Never in the history of our democracy, an executive decree of this sort was used to do a comprehensive reform program. It was more used for some very punctual initiatives. For example, in that decree, we had the labor reform we had there, and then it got an injunction in the labor courts. So then we had to go to Congress, and then we finally got it approved in February of this year. So some parts of those decrees were challenged, because you can be challenged at the judicial level, parts of the decree. And I must say that that was the only big executive decree, and most of the other things we've done going to Congress, in spite of having this. So I don't want to overstate the use of these decrees. I mean, I think it was very, very important at the beginning, because it's like Milei said, I'm here, okay? And I'm here stepping strong, and I'm here and I mean business. And really that executive decree really had that tremendous power, and was a political shockwave, both on society and on the political system. And look, it's interesting to look at, because you can go to YouTube and you have the conference, which it's decree 7023, because it was in 23, because it was in I think the 17th of December of 23. So 7 days into his term, he was sworn in on the 10th. And you can see him for 20 minutes, and the conference says, I'm going to repeal this law because of this. I'm going to repeal this law because of this. I'm going to, which were coming from that pile that you saw, correct? And he's 20 minutes repealing laws and explaining why he's repealing it. But it's like that, no? Boom, boom, boom. Not lengthy discussion. This because of this because of this. And so I think that initial decree was really set the stage for everything else. But it's not that kind of, that's the way we've kind of pushed policy really.
Advice to Austria?
No, I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough to give any. Don't ask an Argentine for advice. Listen, I'm just telling you our experience, okay? Then you will know how to process that. Now, the first question had to do about, well, how things are doing, the number of firms, etc. I mean, you have to be careful with the statistics. First of all, as I mentioned, the economy grew 6% the first year, grew 3% the following year. When you look, because sometimes for us it's difficult in the political discussion, because people say, oh, people are having a hard time. So how do you react to that as a politician? Because if you say, oh, that's not true, you're not empathic, correct? But as a policymakers, what we have to do is we have to go with the data, because if imagine that all the economic indicators are going down and I go on TV and say, no, we're fine because I have a friend of mine who says that he's doing great. And people say, but the economy is going down. So we have to base our analysis on the data. And the data basically shows that the output in Argentina is at a record level, that consumption is at a record level, which doesn't mean that everybody is consuming at a record level. There's a huge change. So for example, in the Neuquén province, which is the energy province, the wages are already twice what they are in the greater Buenos Aires area. So you have disparity in experiences. But overall, the numbers are that export at a record level, the output is at a record level, consumption is at a record level, construction is not at a record level, industrial production is not at a record level, but overall the economy is at a record level. And so there is this disparity. And for example, when you think about firms, and some people flag the number of firms, and you look at the overall number of firms, and you see that there has been a decrease in the firm, you see that the number of firms that have decreased are the firms of one employee. No, and but when you look at firms which have more than 2 employees, you basically have no change in the number of firms. And you may say, why did the one employee firms fell so much? And probably my hypothesis for that is that we virtually phased out a wealth tax that we had, and some people had kind of these companies which were shells to insulate themselves from the wealth tax. And once you fade away that wealth tax, those companies that have no sense, and so you have a lot of decrease in the number. That's kind of a hypothesis. But if you look at firms which are, I have a tweet where I explain this. If you take firms which are more than 2 employees, particularly if you have more than 5 employees, there's no really significant change in the number of firms. There's also not a significant increase, but definitely there's not a decrease, okay? And but I think, as I said at the beginning, it's the fact that this growth process is export-led is a total novelty in Argentina. And this, I think that the regulation program is very instrumental in creating these facilities for people to export, like the guy that you saw, the watermelons. But if you see small firms export, they're growing at 40%. Industrial exports, they're growing at 40%. So I'm very, I'm very optimistic in that regard. And then you have, so for those of you who are not, I mean, the government has received some allegations of corruption of some employees. I always say that Javier is like a Franciscan monk. I mean, I've never seen anybody who's so unattached to material goods. I mean, this is a guy who believes in his ideas, he believes in freedom, he wants to show to the world that freedom works, that Argentina can be prosperous again. And I think that all the team, I think, share those values. But of course, the opposition, all the opposition leaders, they're all in jail because of corruption. So they have to, they're permanently trying to say everybody is like us, you know, because that makes them not look as bad. But all the allegations that they do, they never are supported in court. So we collaborate with the courts, and we clear things to the courts, and then so far they've not been able to prove any allegation that they've made. So I'm totally relaxed on that issue, and I'm sure also that they will continue pounding on this way. But anyway, that's kind of the rules of the game.
So we are starting to run out of time, but I think we take 4 more questions to the highest bidders.
Okay. You'll have to pay me. He's not paying me anything, by the way, but I think I'm going to ask for a compensation. Okay.
Thomas Gangl.
Thank you for this inspiring speech. 2 things are probably important to make some big changes: sense of urgency, and that someone trusts you that you can do that. How did you create, or was there no need to create sense of urgency? Because in Austria, I think we have sometimes a bit the problem that this is not common view.
Yeah.
And second, communication was probably an important part as well. How did you deal with that, and what was the critical or some critical elements on that? Thank you.
So Maximilian Hadeck. So I think we're going into agriculture now.
I have a friend in Argentina who is in the agricultural business and tourist business, in the General Pinto area. So I told him I will meet Minister Sturzenegger today, what to ask him. He said he's very happy about the reforms, but he says it goes beyond a period of legislation, because in Argentina he believes it needs cultural change and a change of mindset of the people, because you had the Peronismo for so long. What will you undertake to make this new reform turn into a cultural change and change of mindset?
Andreas Unterberger.
Thank you. Two short questions. First, what do you think about hereditary taxes? Second,
what taxes?
Erbschaftssteuer, hereditary.
If inheritance tax.
Second, for quite some weeks, hundreds or thousands of people in Austria know that you come here. How many politicians, how many economists have asked you to meet them?
The second question I can answer.
I'm here only a few hours, okay?
Herr Germüller.
Thank you very much. Really impressive what you've achieved. Just a question, because you said your biggest allies in this reform process were the victims. And in a country like Austria, where we have a very lavish welfare state, where only a few people contribute and the majority takes more out of the system than they contribute, I'm a bit skeptical that here your biggest allies would also be the victims, because most people benefit from this very lavish redistribution of wealth. So I wanted to ask, how could this be overcome?
I think there was one question ahead. Is Mr. Bramhofer, if I'm seeing it correctly?
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring speech here. And I hear you loud and clear that you say that we shouldn't ask you for advice. However, we had a couple of questions about how we can deal with deregulation in Austria. However, can you share some thoughts on European level and regulation on European level, as we all know that most of the regulation now comes from Europe? Thank you.
So the question is, what do we do with Europe?
How do we fight European regulation? How do you see that?
I don't know. Look, you're in trouble. That's the only thing I can say, okay? Because in addition of your own regulation, you have to deal with the Brussels. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes, okay? No, I mean, I'm here for those, if someone asked if someone had asked to meet with me, I mean, I think we're very few hours. I arrived today and I'm leaving tonight, so it's...
But I have to add, we invited, just to let you know, we invited the whole government. And there are some economists here from the Vienna University of Economics. The members of government were all very busy today. So unfortunately, they could not find the time to meet you.
Don't worry.
But there are some members of parliament here. I see two at the moment. Mr. Bramhofer.
Look, it doesn't affect my ego, and you're a wonderful crowd, okay? So and they can also watch the video anywhere. So I don't have really a position taken on the inheritance tax. So if you allow me, I'll skip that one. I think the comment on the nature of the victims and the beneficiaries in Austria, I think is a very clever, it's interesting. Definitely it's different in Argentina. We did have a large, I think I mentioned this, we had a large social program, which is a allowance to children, poor children in Argentina. That's our biggest social program. And the president didn't touch that at all. In fact, he strengthened that program. And he also cut some intermediaries in the funneling of the money, so really people had a big boost in that. All the cuts that we did were the pork, the uselessness, etc. So So the question is how much fat you have on the other side. So in Argentina, it was all waste. I don't think here it probably is not all waste, because if it would be all waste, then you wouldn't be as rich as you are, okay? So certainly the government here has to be working much better than in Argentina. So I don't know. You'll have to see how much margin there is there. The sense of urgency, we didn't have to do anything because the previous government kind of took care of that, okay? So they just was such a catastrophe that, I mean, anyway. Like Javier says, Javier says, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, you're never going to have the first liberal libertarian president in the world, okay? But the conditions of pressure and temperature in Argentina were not normal at the end of 2023, okay? So that leaves me with the question of communication and the question of the change of mindset, which are a little bit related. In fact, Milei says, my biggest fight is the cultural change. And so he's a president which spends a lot of time in doing that and fighting the ideas and defending the ideas. So he doesn't get into the micromanagement. He trusts his ministers. If he doesn't like it, he sacks you, okay? But while he likes what you're doing, he's supportive, but he doesn't mess up with you. So that's what makes the government very efficient and we don't have any bottlenecks in the production process of our reforms. And he spends a lot of time on the communication. I think that's exactly what a CEO should do, which look in the horizon, look the storms ahead. Fernando Enrique Cardoso, which was president of Brazil, said that governing is explain, explain, and explain, and communicate. No, so the president does this. He does this in social media. He's very active in social media. I already explained how he supports the work of his ministers in doing that. But there's a dimension of cultural change. And to be honest, I mean, it's amazing what he's done, because this is a person who started on the TV shows 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And while everybody in Argentina for 50 years, the message they had gotten is that if you had a problem, the state is the solution. Milei came on TV saying, the source of your problem is the state. So it was exactly the opposite message. And he said it in a transparent. Today at lunch, we were talking, how do you choose a friend? Do you choose a friend which is a politician, is always trying to please you and say what you want to listen? Or you choose a friend which speaks frankly to you? There's no question how you choose your friend, correct? You want someone to be honest and to be, maybe he or she has to say something that you don't want to hear. But you value them as a friend because of exactly that. And with the politicians, it's exactly the same. And I was, at lunch, I was mentioning that, for example, in the electoral, I'll tell you 2 things about Javier's communication style, 3 things I'll tell you. So for example, when he goes into the ballotage, he gets on stage to thank for the election, which takes it to a ballotage. And he says, well, I want to thank everybody for the ballotage, but remember, social justice is theft. So, wow. He's going into the ballotage. Any politician would have moderated. Why does he think that social justice is theft? Because it's the government saying, I take money from someone to give it to someone else. And for that, that is theft. Because the allocation of resources has to be to the products that you produce in the market. And the government should not mess with that. But I mean, running into a ballotage, saying that, amazing. The second thing I'm going to tell you about communication is we're in the electoral campaign last year. So Congress is trying to undermine our fiscal surplus, because our fiscal surplus is kind of the most extraordinary achievement of this government after 100 years of deficits. So the Congress passes a law to increase pensions. And he said, oh, the Congress has passed this law to increase pensions. I'm going to veto this thing. So the team says, oh, but I mean, how are you going to communicate to the population that Congress says? Of course, Congress didn't say where the money was going to come from, correct? They just say spend. So as the president says, leave that to me. So he goes on TV and says, well, you know, the Congress has passed this thing to increase pensions. I know pensioners deserve to get more pensions. There are no resources here, so I don't know where we're getting the money to pay for this. And that's the reason I'm vetoing. And the people who voted for this in Congress, they're fiscal rapists. They're rapists of the fiscal stability. And they want us to go back to the 50 years of inflation, which left us with 70% of the kids poor. And when the population say, well, this guy is speaking the truth. And they don't believe the politicians because the politicians have been throwing and selling promises for years, and the only thing that people got out of that was poverty, in a way that you wouldn't imagine here in Austria. So they say, we stick to this guy, which is speaking what he really thinks his mind. So I think that was amazing. I think it has to be the first time in the world that a politician does something like that during an election period, campaign. And people want that because they want to get away of that economy of 50 years of inflation that they're totally fed up. And the other thing which I think this is just, this is kind of amazing. It's amazing. So we're in the election, no? And then we had, the election last year had a lot of provincial elections. And then in the province of Buenos Aires, we did very poorly. And then we realized afterwards, eventually in the October election, we won. And we realized there had been a lot of fraud in that election, whatever, doesn't matter. But the most amazing thing is that, and also after the elections, the guy who would be kind of the potential candidate started saying, well, if we come to the government in 4 years, the first thing we're going to go is default debt. So country risk skyrocketed. So he really was trying to create a liquidity crisis for a government, which was a fiscal surplus. There's no solvency problem. And I think people got really scared, you know, so we can't have this kind of these crazy people, okay? And I think that turned out to the benefit. But they were hammering with this kind of alleged corruption things. So kind of, we were a little bit kind of there in the middle of that thing. And then Javier says, okay, I'm gonna do a rock concert. What? I'm gonna do a rock concert. I could go to a stadium and I'm 15,000 people and I'll do a rock show. Because, you know, he had a band, he had a rock band. And I thought it was a great idea from the start. Other people in the cabinet didn't think it was a great idea because of the general mood, no? And so he went, so we did it in the Movistar Arena, 12,000 people. And he does his rock concert, but pretty good, by the way, so you can watch it on YouTube. And he turned around the election. And the reason he turned around the election is that people were seeing how the opposition was kind of harassing the government. And then they want to create the idea that they've broken you. And people want change, they don't want to go to the past. But then if they feel the government is broken or the leaders are broken, say, well, then I need to choose someone else to carry the flag of this fight. And when he showed himself strong and making fun of the guys, making fun of their violence, making fun of their accusations, and people say, oh, this guy, he's strong. So look at the complexity, no? Of the tremendous amount of dimensions that the communication has these days. It's not just, oh, I'm proposing this, So Milei has some resources that I think very few politicians in the world have, because, I mean, how many politicians can get up on a stage and do a rock concert, okay? And so I think I already talked about his communication in social media, his attention to the issue, the diversity of strategies that he uses for this, and the focus on the changing of the mindset, which was the question, and I think he's been tremendously successful in doing that. You ask a poll in Argentina whether Argentina should have a fiscal surplus. 85% of the people say that Argentina should have a fiscal surplus. So he's really changed the mindset. But again, for me, people have the mindset, but if you don't change the economic structure of the status quo and you don't weaken that, it's gonna eat that as well. So I think the cultural change is important, but the change of the economic structure is the one which is really going to consolidate the change, or let's say both things together. No? So yeah, this is a guy with a lot of resources, but he also puts the energy where it has to put, because he could be putting the energy in the micromanagement and he's not. So he has also the intelligence to focus on the cultural change and kind of try to see the storms ahead way in advance. So I'm blessed to have the opportunity. It's kind of, for me, when people ask me how you're doing, I say, I'm in Disney. Because for me, I believe in freedom, having a president which believes in the same, is willing to support and has all these resources, well, this is the result. This happens once in a lifetime, so boy, how lucky I've been. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.